All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsors, Paul for the month of Sivan, Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating all the Shuman Drushos this month. As a zechus refuah sheleimah for Kathy's sister, Donna Baker-Matson. We thank our Day of Learning sponsors, Lauren Suffness, in loving memory of his beloved brother Matthew Suffness, Motel ben Josef, Zichrono Livracha, and to thank Jeremy Lassen for dedicating today's shir in honor of the home run derby winner, Dovid Flamm. I'm not sure what the rest of that narrative is, but all right, mazel tov to that. Baruch Hashem, when David comes in, make sure to wish him a hearty mazel tov. I will say with that, let us begin. We'll say with beautiful daf ahead of us today. A lot to do today. Today's daf is chof. We are picking up on your Testament base 19b. We are picking up 20 lines up from the bottom. We actually got a little bit further than that, but let's just begin with this case again. So the Gemara says as follows: Amar Shmuel, Nasan laniyar chalak. A man gives a woman a blank piece of paper. V'amar la harezi kidech, and he says to her, "This is your get." Nigurashas. She's divorced. Why? What are we concerned about? That maybe he wrote it with gallnut juice. And I will say, therefore what? Therefore what we're concerned about is he wrote a get. The get, the writing itself was absorbed into the parchment, but ultimately, again, there's a get that's there. So basically, Mara says, 1 second. We'll see, interesting case over here. A man says to a woman, "This is your get." And then he takes it back from her and he throws it into the sea. Or into the fire. Or I will say, point over here, it doesn't really matter where he throws it. The point is, he's throwing it now and it's no longer retrievable. In other words, it's destroyed. So what happens? Then the Rabbi says, so now afterwards, he then goes back and he says, by the way, it wasn't a get. It was a different kind of document. We saw about this in yesterday's shir. Shtar aman or shtar pasim are documents that seem to indicate a transaction occurred, when in fact, again, a transaction didn't occur. They're really just there to make a person's credit look better than it actually is. So this is what he's claiming. He's claiming that in fact there was no get. What's the halacha? So the Gemara says, Migurashas, she is Migurashas, v'lo kolimena la'osra. And ultimately, again, he is not believed to forbid her. Now, I'll say what that means is, since the get was given, he's not believed to go ahead and now say that she's a married woman again by claiming that the get was invalid. Now, I'll say, now why? Now, the reason in that second case why he is not believed to go ahead and say that it wasn't a get was because there was writing on the document. Remember again, the case was, he gave her a get, he says, Harat Nigurashas, he then takes the get back, throws it into the fire, and it's destroyed. So the Gemara, and then he claims, by the way, it wasn't a get, it was really a different kind of document. So the Gemara says he is not believed to do that. Now, why is he not believed? Because Lamaisa, there was a get with writing on it that was seen. So we'll say, what do you see from here? You see from here that giving someone a blank piece of paper and saying Harei Zegiteich is seemingly not enough. So the Gemara says, Haleka Ksav Lo. If there was no writing, ultimately, again, it shouldn't be a get. Therefore, going back to the case we started with today, which was the case of Shmuel. Shmuel said, man gives his wife a blank piece of paper and says, this is your get. What's the halacha? Migurashas. She's divorced. Why? Because we think maybe the get was written in gallnut juice. But based on what we just learned, that should be incorrect. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Ki kamer Shmuel, debat kinale b'maya dinara. We'll say this is very interesting. What we do is, when we see him give her a blank piece of parchment or a blank piece of paper, what we do is we test it with a type of dye. I palit, the lo palit lav klumhu. If it was written with gallnut juice, this type of dye will cause the writing to emerge, to become visible. So if the dye causes the writing to become visible, ultimately, again, we know it's a get. If not. So Gemara says, 1 second. V'chi palit, my hobby. Well, let me get this straight. So a man gives a woman a blank piece of paper. He says, Harei Zegiteich, this is your get. So now, we go ahead, we subject it to the dye test. If writing comes out, it's a get. If writing doesn't come out, it's not a get. That doesn't make any sense. V'chi palit my hobby, hashtahu de palit. I will say, that's fine that when you apply the dye, the writing comes out, but that's happening now. That's happening after he's given it to her. In other words, we'll say, for a get to be effective, the get, the writing has to be visible when? At the Zman Yasin, at the time that it's given. The fact, at the time when it's given, we'll say, the time that it was given, what was the status of this piece of paper? What was the status? It was blank. It's very nice that now afterwards you're bringing out writing, but how does after Nesina writing help with this type of situation? To which the Gemara says, you're right. Shmuel Nami Chashinan Kamar. So Rabbi said, this is fascinating, going to open the door to a riveting conversation. Shmuel himself, Rabbi said, Chashinan. Rabbi say, Chashinan is going to open up a new category of halacha for us. We're going to see that in Gittin cases, there are one of three scenarios. Scenario one, the get is good. Scenario two, the get is not good. Scenario three, Chashinan. What Chashinan means is we have to be concerned that perhaps the get was valid. And Rabbi said that's going to manifest itself in a variety of different ways. Take a quick look at Rashi. Chashinan, Shema lo nivlu yafa, v'im meis asur l'koim, v'choletzes v'lo misyabemes, the suffik grushu. So Rabbi said we're going to see an interesting situation over here. Chashinan means that essentially we treat it as a suffik get. A suffik get. Now I will say, what does it mean a suffik get? So suffik get often emerges in the following situation. Imagine I will say, let's just play this out. Right? So what happens? Reuven gives Rachel a piece of paper, or a get. He says, Hare zegitech. We open it up, it's blank. I will say, so now what happens? We do the dye test, and sure enough, letters come out, right? A get is there. So we'll say, what's the status of such a get? What did the Gemara say? It's a suffik. Because what don't we know? Were the letters fully present, not fully present at the time the get was given? It's suffik. How does suffik manifest itself? If Reuven now dies, let's say he gives the get, we do the dye test, he dies right afterwards. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Number one, we're not going to let her marry a Kohen because maybe she's a migureshes, maybe she's a divorcee, not a widow. We're also not going to let her do yibum, right? But we're going to make her do chalitza. So the point over here is chashinan means it's a suffik get. So we're going to talk much more about suffik get cases afterwards. But good. So the Gemara says as follows. Ravina said, Rabbi Amemar, Hachi Amar Mereimar Mishmeid Rav Dimi. This is what Mereimar said to Rav Dimi. Hani be trey diyayev gita kamayu tzrichil mekarye. So I'll say ultimately again, when you go ahead and you give a get in front of two people, i.e. Eidei Mesira, right? When you're giving a get over in front of two witnesses. Ultimately, again, they have to read it. They have to read the get. So they say first the widest lines at the bottom. They say, the man says to his wife, this is your get. And then what Rabbi say? Then he takes it back and throws it into the sea or into the fire. The Chazava Amar Shtar Pasim Hu Shtar Amanahu Migureshes. So we'll say, so here we go. What do we just say? When you give over a get in front of Eidei Mesira, what do you have to do? The Eidei Mesira have to read the get. Umar says, really interesting. Let's go back to the case we just said. Reuven gives Rachel a get. Then after he gives it, he takes it back, and what does he do? He throws it into the fire, and the document is destroyed. After the document is destroyed, Reuven says, by the way, it wasn't a get. What was it? It was one of these. It was one of these type of documents just to build up someone's credit. Shtar amana, shtar pasim. Fine. So we'll say, what's the halacha? We don't believe him. She is migureshes, and he is not believed. Now, 1 second. V'i amrit tzrichil mekaria basad dekaryua mi matzi amr lahaki. 1 second. If it's true, say that when you give a get over in front of Eidei Mesira, that's what? Eidei Mesira have to read it. So we'll say, what does that mean? Eidim read that it was a get. If Eidim read that it was a get, that when he takes it back, throws it into the fire, and claims that it wasn't a get, is he going to be believed? Of course not. To which the Gemara says, you're right. We'll say, listen to this case. It's great. Lo tzricha de basad de karyua ilaya lebeyade va'afke. Listen to this. What's the case over? The case over here is where we're concerned that after he gave the get, he went ahead and, after they read it, husband took it back, put it up his sleeve, and then took it back out again. What would you have thought? Chalufe. Maybe he switched documents. Kamash Malon, no. Kamash Malon, both say that we're not choshesh for that. Okay, interesting. Both say 4 lines up from the bottom. Halu Gavra, great case here. Tizorik lo gita ledvisu lebene doni. Supposed to listen to this. It was a man who threw a get to his wife. Now, I will say we're going to talk extensively about these kind of cases of throwing a get to someone and having her be divorced depending on where it lands. Now, again, in this case, we will say husband threw a get to his wife, and what happened? It landed beinei dani. It landed between the jars. Okay, so what happens? Ishtachach mezuzta. So she went to retrieve it, and what did she find there? She found a mezuzah, a cloth of a mezuzah. That's what she found there. Rav Nachman, mezuzta beinei dani lo shchicha. So we'll say to find the mezuzah between the jugs is not a common occurrence. It's not a common occurrence, and therefore we'll say, look at Rashi. Rashi says lo shchiach v'zohi shezarak zeh v'ein lochosh shemaget zarak lava avad. So we'll say it's uncommon to find the mezuzah between the jugs. So I'll say, let's just take a step back for a second. What do we know? It's a husband and wife, Reuven and Rachel. What did Reuven do? He threw a get to his wife, or at least he threw a document that he told his wife was a get. The document Reuven threw landed between the jugs, right between the jugs. Rachel goes between the jugs and retrieves a document. The document she picked up was what? Turned out to be a mezuzah. A mezuzah. So we'll say, now what's our shayla? Is that the document that the husband threw or not? Right? Is that the David, Mazel Tov on the beautiful accomplishment yesterday. Shkayach Merit Hashem should be a source of inspiration for the Dori Doros. I said, so here's the interesting question. So the interesting question is as follows. Is the document that the wife finds. Let's say, is that the document that the husband threw? And therefore it turns out that what? It turns out that the husband threw her a mezuzah? Or do we say no, he threw her a get, it just happens to be that something else happened to the get, and the document that she's finding there was just a mezuzah. To which the Gemara says, it's uncommon to find a mezuzah between the jugs. Because of that, I will say, what do we assume? That what she found is what he threw. And therefore, halacha lamaisa, she is not divorced. Incredible. Not divorced. So the Gemara says, v'hanimili, d'ishtach al-chada. That's only true if she found one mezuzah there. Aval bezu gimel, but if she found a couple of mezuzah scrolls there, midahai havi, ha nami havi. V'gita emer achbarim shakli. But I will say, if she found a couple of mezuzahs there, that means that what? That obviously somebody was throwing mezuzahs between the jugs. And therefore, again, we assume that the mezuzahs were there before. The husband did, in fact, throw a get. And it must have been the mice carried the get away. I was like, by the way, if you have mice that are carrying full documents away, you've got some issues in the house, right? I was like, but lamaisa, so fasting. So that's where choshesh for. So we'll say, these are just further examples of these chayshinon cases. Good. Hu gavra. I will say this is a great case. 2 lines over the bottom. Hu gavra. Da'alabi knishta. Guy went to shul. Listen to this. Shakal Sefer Torah. He takes out a Sefer Torah. Yohiv leila dvisu. He gives the Torah to his wife. Va'amar la hagiteich. Fascinating. He gives her a Sefer Torah and he says to her, this is your get. Rav Yosef. So Rav Yosef is like, what should we be concerned about this? In other words, we'll say it doesn't sound by any stretch of the imagination that this is a valid case. What should we be concerned about? Imishum meimilin, ein meimilin agabe meimilin. So maybe we should be concerned like this. Maybe on the back of the parchment of the Sefer Torah, he wrote a get. Maybe that's what's happening over here. He wrote a document on the back of the parchment. Now we'll say, why wouldn't that work? Remember, parchment is treated with meimilin, it's treated with golnut juice. If he's writing golnut juice on top of golnut juice, it's not going to work. In other words, we'll say, we see that there's no writing on the back of the piece of parchment. So what are we concerned about? Meimilin agabe meimilin. Meimilin agabe meimilin is insignificant. Top of chav. Imishum krisos te isba. So we'll say, this is interesting. It's fascinating. Maybe what he's doing is like this. We'll say, maybe, this past week's Parshas Naso. Maybe what he's saying is, Parshas Naso in the Torah, which talks about Gittin, ultimately again should go ahead and be your. Not Parshas Naso. Chumash Devarim. Excuse me. So I will say Chumash Devarim. Ultimately again, the Parsha of Gerushin should be your get. Isn't that fascinating? In other words, the parsha in the Torah, again, both you can see it's Devarim Parak Chaf Dalet. Maybe that will be your get. So the Gemara says, Imishun Krisos de Isba, Ba'inon Vikas of law Lishma Veleka. That's not going to work. I will say why. Because halacha lemaisa, a get has to be written Lishma. And obviously, again, taking a Sefer Torah, giving her a Sefer Torah and saying the parsha of Gittin inside of the Torah, ultimately, again, should be your get, is not going to work. V'chitema leicha shtilma actin v'yohav lazuz l'safra meikara. So let's listen to this. Well, maybe the guy had this in mind, and what did he do? Assessing. What did he do? When the sofer was writing the Sefer Torah, maybe the guy went ahead and what? Maybe he went ahead and paid the sofer money and said to the sofer, when you're writing the section of Gittin in the Torah, have in mind from me and my wife. Right? You ever wonder what people go ahead and whisper to the sofer when they're holding the quill, right? Right? Have in mind for me and my wife. To which the Gemara says that's not going to work. Why? Haba inon shina shma ushma shemi rav shemi rav aleka. The Gemara says obviously not going to work. Why? Because let's remember again, a get has to have the name of the husband, the name of the wife, and the name of the locale. So I'll say, so therefore, what are we trying to figure out over here? So the only possible thing is that maybe a husband wrote a get on the back of the parchment. Maybe that's what it is that we are really concerned about. Rav Yosef, my kamash malon. Rav Yosef, what is it coming to teach us? She'ein me'milin al gabe me'milin. Ultimately, again, that you can't write gallnut juice on top of parchment treated with gallnut juice. To which the Gemara says, so therefore, again, that's what it's coming to teach me. That Allah L'maisa, maybe you'd be concerned that he's writing a get in gallnut juice on the back of the parchment. Kamash malan ein me'milin al gabe me'milin. It doesn't work. Okay, good. Amr of Chista. We'll say next case. Fascinating case over here. Get shekasvu shelo lishma. So I'll say here's the following situation. Imagine you have a situation of a get that was written shelo lishma. So we'll say, what's an example of a get written shelo lishma? Very simple. Ruvain is married to Rachel and Ruvain is divorcing Rachel. Or thinking about divorcing Rachel. One day, Ruvain is walking, he sees by the garbage dump that somebody threw out a get, and amazingly enough, what are the names in the get? Ruvain and Rachel. Simin mina shamayim. Siyata dishmaya, the Ribono shel Olam wants me to get out of this marriage. He goes ahead and he takes the get. Only one problem, it wasn't written for him. It was written for someone else. He has a great zach. What does he do? He takes it to the sofer. He says, sofer, do me a favor. Just trace over it lishma. Trace over Lishma. In other words, document is fine. All the information in the document is absolutely fine. So let's say, so get shekasu shalosha, that's the case over here. So the get was written shalo Lishma, v'havir alav kulmos Lishma. And then what happens? The sofer literally traces over the letters Lishma. Having in mind Lishma, does that work? Does that work or not? So it says the Gemara, Banu lemachlokas, Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbanon. We'll say this seems to be the very machlokes in the Rabbanu. This is fascinating. What's the case? This anya. Harisha yitarach lichtov es Hashem. So we'll say what happens. Let's say someone was writing, a sofer was writing a Sefer Torah, and he was about to write the name of Hashem. About to write the name of Hashem. And I will say what happened. Now remember when writing a Sefer Torah, the sofer has to have explicit kavanah for Shem Hashem, for the name of God. See, he had in mind to write the Shem Hashem, and what happens? V'niskavin lichtov Yehuda, so v'tal v'lo hitel bo dalet. So we'll say, then what happened? Then, accidentally, he had in mind to write the name Yehuda. But then he made a mistake when writing Yehuda, and he left out the dalet. So what did he get? We'll say, what do you get when you leave out the dalet of Yehuda? Yud Hey, and then Vav and Hey, the name of Hashem. The problem is, he wrote the name without kavanah. Right? So in other words, he ended up with the name of Hashem, but his intention ultimately was to go ahead and write Yehuda. So what's the halacha? Mavir alav komos umakatra de Rabbi Yehuda. He says, no problem. Just trace over it with a quill, and you're good to go. Trace over with a quill, and you're good to go. These words of Rabbi Yehuda. Cham necham say, no. Ein Hashem min hamuvchar. So we'll say, so Ein Hashem min hamuvchar means, sounds like it's not lechatchila. We'll see, again, if you look at Rashi says over here, Rashi doesn't say over here. We're going to see in a little bit. In Shemin HaMuvchar means it's not kosher. It's not kosher. So I will say, so a fundamental machlokes. What do you see over here? You've written the name of Hashem without proper kavanah. So can you remedy that? Rabbi Yehuda says, yeah. What do? Trace over it with a quill. This time doing it l'shem Hashem, right, for the sake of Hashem, and you're good to go. Rabbi Yehuda says tracing over with a quill does not work. So I will say, the Gemara is assuming the same machlokes here will also be the same machlokes where? Same machlokes where? By Gittin. You find, right, Ruvain finds a get that happens to have the same names, Ruvain and Rachel, same locale, his own city, but it wasn't written Lishma. No problem, Ruvain says. Bring it to the sofer, just trace it over, Lishma. Does that work? Machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon. To which the Gemara says, Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov Dilma Lohi. The machloksim don't necessarily line up. How so? Ad kano kamri Rabbanon hasam dib ela diba ina zekili va'an vehu veleka aval hacha lo. So I will say, it could very well be. So comes Rav Acha bar Yaakov and says, not necessarily, in other words, even the Rabbanon who disagree in the case of the Shem Hashem might only pass on the case of Hashem Hashem. Why? Because when writing the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, one needs to meet the requirement of Zekeli Va'anveyu, which is Hidr Mitzvah. Hidr Mitzvah. That when writing the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, perhaps that process has to be done in the most ideal fashion. In other words, you can't go ahead and get it wrong and then trace over. In other words, Lamaisa, when writing it, it has to be done correctly. So according to the Rabbanon, if you write the name of Hashem without kavanah, you can't trace over it. But it could very well be by a get. Ultimately, again, such a process would in fact work. So I'll just mention to you the Rambam, because that's the end of that sugi over there. The Rambam Paskins in Hilchos Gerishin, Perek Gimel Halacha Vav. Listen to this. V'chol get shekasvu shelo lishma. If you have a get that was written not lishma, afa pi shehevir alav komos lishma, eno get. Even if you go ahead and you trace over it lishma, ultimately again it does not work. It does not work. So I will say it's actually interesting what you see from here. I was just thinking about this a little bit. That if you kind of contrast this a little bit to yesterday's daf, right? What did we learn in yesterday's daf? That sometimes you could take certain writing right on top of it and re-energize that writing, right? So you could take your red writing, right? Your red writing, your sikra, and you could go ahead and put yo on top of it, black ink, and it's a new act of writing, right? And yet sometimes, if you have something that's written, as much as you try to write over it, you can't. So we'll say, so the dynamic is quite fascinating. We understood from the diyo agabe sikra, the black ink on top of red ink, what was our Musar Haskell? Our Musar Haskell was that tshuva is possible. You could make mistakes in life and you could rewrite your narrative. So I will say it is interesting to see that maybe some things you can't rewrite. In other words, some things, once they're flawed, and we know this, right? Shalom Melech writes in Koheles, Mu'uvas lo yuchal liskon, v'chesron lo yuchal lihimanos. There are certain things that are so bent, that are so crooked, that they cannot be made straight. If you remember again, the Gemara explains what's an example, not Musach's Brachas, what's an example of Mu'uvas lo yuchal liskon, something that is bent, that cannot be made straight. What does the Gemara give an example of? A mamzer. Right? A mamzer, which makes sense. A person commits an illicit relationship, that relationship yields a mamzer, I will say you can't walk that back. Right? You can't walk it back. That is an irreversible reality. Or even again, right, a missed tefillah. But even missed tefillah, the Gemara says there's a tashlumin, but a mamzer. So we'll say it's one of the most sobering things in life that as much as we try to always focus on the idea that you could always put your diyo on top of sikra, right? You could always put your black ink on top of red ink. You could always rectify your mistakes. The sobering reality in life is there are some mistakes that I can't rectify. There are some things that I can't walk back. There are some things where once they are shelo l'shma, you could write over it as many times as you want. It's not going to change the reality. So I'm going to say, what do you do with those things? What do you do with the realities you can't change? You move forward. Right? If I can't change it, I got to move forward. But that's how the Rambam paskin. So again, Halacha Lamaisa Perek Gimel Halacha Vav. Any get that was in Shalom Lishma, Afa Pi Shever Lav Komos Lishma Ino get. So I'm going to say these two paradigms. Diyoa Gabe Sikra works, right? You can rewrite certain things, But again, a get lishma, no matter how many times you write over it, lishma is not going to change it. Certain realities you can change, other realities you cannot. Incredible. So let's go back there. This is a pretty strong statement. Rav Chisda, Yachilna lemifsalina lekula giti de alma. Rav Chisda said, I could passel every single get in the world. Good, shkoyach, right? I just want to say, right? So watch this. The Gemara says, what does this mean? So Amrali Rava, my time. So Rav says, whoa, what's up with that? What does that mean? To which the Gemara says, Ilayim mishum dechsiv v'kasav v'hacha ihu kakasvalei. So Rav said, we're going to talk about this. In an ideal sense, a get, right? The parchment, the cost of the parchment, the cost of the sofer, all of that is to be borne by the husband. To be borne by the husband, right? Because again, the get has to come from him. V'hacha, Naboseh, we're going to see, interestingly enough, that they instituted a practice, ihi kakasvalei. They instituted a practice, Naboseh, that the woman pays for the get, or the woman pays for the sofer. Naboseh, now why do that? Why do that? Because Chazal wanted to make sure that the process gets moving. You see, sometimes the way that the husband could kind of drag his feet on this is to not pay. So like this, Chazal gave, obviously the husband can pay, but Chazal also opened the door to having the woman pay, not that she's obligated to pay, but to give her the ability to pay. This way it can move the process along. So is that what it is? Is that what it is? V'hacha ika kasole v'doma aknuye aknule rabanan. Maybe Rabbi will say, even though the woman is paying for it, ultimately, again, Chazal were makne, the husband. So we'll say, see, here's what's interesting. If she's paying for it, then what that means is she owns the parchment. She owns the parchment. The problem is that technically, the husband is supposed to be the owner of the parchment. To which the Gemara says, well, if that's the big deal over here, if that's the big deal, that's fine. Chazal could just convey ownership of the parchment to the husband. It's hefker based in hefker. They could convey ownership. Ve'elu mishra, that's not it. Ve'elu mishum d'chsiv v'nasan v'hacha lo yohiv la midi. So we'll say, no, rather, what's the problem? The problem ultimately is that the Torah says v'nasan. Husband has to give her the get. Now, we'll say the Gemara's understanding over here that v'nasan means that the get has to be a shaveh pruta. The document itself should be worth some amount of money, and sometimes the get isn't, the document itself isn't worth anything. To which the Gemara says, "V'hacha lo yarav lamidi dilma nesinas geti teda d'shalchem itam kasvu alisuri hana'a kasher." So I say ultimately again that's not necessarily true. We're going to see that halacha l'maisa, the value of the document itself need not be a pruta. V'haraya, we're going to see about say what? That even if a husband writes the get on an item that is an isser hana, forbidden from getting any benefit from, I will say, what is the value of an item that isn't isser hana? What's the value? 0, because you can't get any hana from it. So we're going to see that even if you write a get on such an item, halacha l'maisa, the get itself is still going to be valid. So therefore, I will say, it turns out, we could take a deep breath, Rav Chisda said he could parcel every single get in the world. It turns out, no, he can't. But I will say, but a couple of really interesting facts do emerge from this. Number one, that in an ideal world, the husband drives the entire process, and ultimately, again, I will say that ideal also turns into one of the great challenges of Gittin. But again, leaving aside a husband who exploits the process, right? The point over here is that the husband should be the one paying the sofer. The husband should be the one ultimately owning the piece of parchment. That's number one. Number two, interesting enough, it appears that a get need not be written on an item of value. So let's discuss this piece a little bit more. So Mar says, Gufa, Shalchem we learned, right? Kasvu alisuri hanal, if you write a get on an item that isn't isser hanal, right? So I'm writing a get on an item, right? Reuven is writing a get on a piece of parchment or on something that ultimately is forbidden for benefit. Kasher, ultimately is kasher. Amravashi, Af anan nami tanan. We also learn this. Allah shal zayis. Also, what did the Mishnah say? Our Mishnah said you can even write a get on what? On a branch or on a leaf from an olive tree. To which the Gemara says, and I will say now bepashtos. Now, what is the Gemara trying to prove over here? We'll say, what is the value of a leaf from an olive tree? 0, or at least not a pruta. So the point over here is, what do you see even from our Mishnah? that you could write the get on an item, right, or on a document or an item that is not even worth a pruta. To which one says, well, maybe not. Dilma shiny Allah shalzayis. Maybe the case of the leaf from the olive tree is different. Why? The chazil it's darufe, because it will say it can always be combined with other things. And I will say, now what does this mean? In other words, one leaf could combine with other leaves. Rashi says over here to become a mattress. Or to become animal food. So in other words, maybe even though the leaf by itself is not significant, but we look at it significantly by virtue of the fact that what? That it could become part of a group. Which I will say, think about the beauty in that statement. That sometimes, maybe I'm not holding on the level where as an individual, I'm doing anything of such great value. But when I become a part of the group, when I become a part of a kehila, when I become part of a community, when I become part of Am Yisrael, that's when ultimately, again, my own personal worth is activated. I will say, we all have times like this in life. If you look at me as an individual, I'm not really accomplishing all that much. But suddenly, again, I become part of a group, I become part of the collective. Suddenly, again, I will say what I can't accomplish, or sometimes the value that maybe I don't have as an individual, ultimately becomes activated through my connection to the collective. A powerful yesod, ultimately, and what it means to be part of the Kehillah community and ultimately an Am. Let's go right there. So Gemara says following. Tanya, Rebbe says, Kasva l'isuri hana kasher. If you go ahead and you wrote to get on a isur hana, ultimately again it's kasher. Okay? Nafik Levi. And I will say that goes to the idea that the document upon which the get is written need not be a shava pruta. Need not be a shava pruta. So it says, Nafak Levi, Darsha Mishvei Rebbe, Velo Kal Suas. Listen to this. So Levi went out, he taught this ruling in the name of Rebbe, namely that you could even write a get on an Isser Hana, and they didn't praise him. Mishmei Rabbim, Vikil Sua. Then he went ahead and he taught it in the name of the rabbin, ultimately in the name of the majority opinion, and it was praised. Alma Hilchosakavase. Therefore, both say, what do you see from here? That the halacha follows Rebbe. So we'll say this is indeed the halacha, namely that the document upon which, in other words, technically speaking, you can write a get even on Isurei Hana. But again, the message for us is that the document the get is written on need not be a Shavar Pruta. Tan Rabbanan. So let's listen to this. Great case over here. The kasav velo chakak. So also listen to this. So the pasuk says, husband has to write his wife a get. The kasav ksiva. Now we'll say, what does that teach me? Velo chakak. Now we'll say chakak is engraving. So I will say the fact that the Torah says kasav is writing, seems to exclude the ability to engrave a get. So husband engraves a get. Lememra. The chakika lav ksivi. I think that engraving is halachically not considered to be writing. So listen to this. Or mini, listen to this. Eved, sheyatza b'ksav shal gabi tavla, upinkas yatza l'cheirus. So let's listen to this. If you write a document of emancipation for an eved and you engrave it on a tablet of some sort, it works. Aval lo b'ksav shal gabi kipa va'anduchdari. But I will say, but not if you embroidered it. So for example, if you go ahead and you take a tablet and you engrave a get shichra on a tablet, then beautiful, it works. If you embroider a get shichra, right? I will say, let's say you embroider a get shichra, right? You embroider the writing on top of a garment, that does not work. I will say, what's the chilik? So ultimately, again, engraving is a permanent type of writing. Embroidering could be easily taken out. And therefore, again, it's not considered writing. But for our purposes, what do you see over here? That engraving, right? Chakika is considered to be writing. So what's going on over here? Amr Ula, Amr Belazar Lokasha. This is great. Hadichak tochos, hadichak girechos. Shabbos said, this is fascinating. There are two different types of engraving. There's what's called chak tochos and chak girechos. Look at Rashi. Rashi is almost right across on the right hand side. Hadachak tochos shel osios vitzidehen va'osios boltos inoksav. We'll say, listen to this. Here's chak tochos. We'll say is, if you could imagine, let's just say you have like a piece of metal. There are two different ways in which you could go ahead and hammer out a letter, right? Either what you could do is you could hammer around the letter, in other words, depress the areas, and by definition, the letter remains, right? So I can hammer the metal all around the letter, right? And ultimately the letter is formed by itself. So we'll say, interestingly enough, I haven't actively formed the letter. What did I do? I manipulated the areas around the letter and didn't manipulate the letter areas of the letter itself that formed the letters. That's called chak tochos, as opposed to chak yerechos, which is an actual engraving of the letter itself. The Gemara says chak tochos, hammering around, right, and allowing the kind of letter to be formed by itself. That's not called writing. Chak yerechos, actually engraving the letter, that's called writing. We'll say fascinating distinction, right? We'll say if you think about it, one is actively writing the letter itself, that's chak yerechos, and one is manipulating the area around the letter so as to allow the letter to be formed. Chak tochos, that's not called writing. That's not called writing a letter. Incredible. The tochos, lo, is that true? Is that true? I'm saying that manipulating the metal around the letter and therefore the letter kind of coming up itself, that's not called writing. So the Gemara says, "Raminu lo haya kasvo shokeh ela bolet kedinari zav." So let's listen to this. This is actually talking about the tzitz. Remember again, the tzitz was the head plate that was worn by the Kohen Gadol that said on it Kodesh LaHashem, sanctified to God. Sanctified to God. So let's listen to this. So the Gemara says, the writing in the tzitz was not sunken. No, what does it mean not sunken? In other words, it wasn't engraved like what we would call chak yerechos, ela bolet. Rather, the writing extended kidinari zav, like a gold coin. To which the Gemara says, v'hadinari zav tochosein. It will say, now generally the way coins are formed is how? They're stamped. Right? How does a stamp work? It depresses areas of the metal and leaves part of it raised. So you see, the tzitz itself sounds like it was made through what we would call chak tochos, and you see from here that it is considered to be a bona fide form of writing. So Gemara says, no. Kidinar zav lo kidinar zav. The tzitz was like a gold coin, not like a gold coin. How so? Kidinar zav, the bolet. On one hand, it was like dinar zav in that what? In that the writing extended out, right? What's the word? Not extended. It was raised. It was raised, right? It was raised, right? V'lo kedinar zav, the hacha tochos v'haka yerechos. Shabbos is interesting, but it was different than coins. How? Coins are ultimately made through a stamp which presses down the middle. The tzitz, Shabbos is fascinating. The tzitz, in fact, was chak yerechos. I will say, how was the tzitz made? The tzitz was hammered out from the back end. So in other words, from the back end, you actually engraved Kodesh LaHashem. But when it was worn with the letters raised on the other side. So it was actually created through what we would call chak yerechos, an actual engraving, a hammering out actually of the letter itself, not of the area around it, but it was worn on the raised end. I was saying, obviously, even miraculously, it switched. In other words, that the way that they hammered it out was the way it appeared, or they wrote it, or maybe they hammered it out, they engraved it backwards, so that when wearing it, in other words, remember again, if you hammer out on the backside Kodesh LaHashem, then obviously when the Kohen wears it, that's not going to be what's seen. So it must be either they reversed the writing, or miraculously, just the engraving reversed itself. The point over here is that tzitz was made through engraving on the backside, but it was worn on the raised side. Incredible. Amar Rabbeinu Ravashi, Roshma Michraz Charetz. O Kinufei Kanif. So we'll say, look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, Roshma Chosim Hamatbea. When you stamp a coin, I will say they're actually talking about a stamp with a die. A stamp with a die. When you go ahead and you stamp a coin with a die, Michras Charetz, Hatokos, Vasilos Shal Tsuraso, Shehuish, Rashi, Shishokas, Chortzim V'dokin Tokos, Usvio Shal Tsura Dinar Odmes, Okinufei Michnav. So I'll say, ultimately, again, it's asking when they stamp a coin, essentially, is it Chak Tochos or is it Chak Yerechos? Amalei, Michras Charetz. Ultimately, again, he said it's Michras Charetz, it's Chak Yerechos. Esvei, is that true? Is that true? Esvei, lo haya kasvo shokea, ela boleit kedinar izav. When they made the tzitz, so ultimately the tzitz did not have like sunken writing, rather it had raised writing like a gold coin. But if you think that a coin ultimately again is like chak yerechos, amud beis, ha ba'ina michtav v'leka. Ultimately again you require ksiva, and ultimately again it's not being accomplished. Excuse me. To which the Gemara says, Kedinar zav, velo kedinar zav. So the same thing as we mentioned before. It's like a gold coin, but not like a gold coin. So the Gemara says, good, Kedinar zav debolate. Ultimately, again, it's like the dinar zav in that it's raised. Velo kedinar zav, the hasami gavai, v'hacha me'avroi. But ultimately, normally a gold coin ultimately again is stamped on the front end, i.e. a coin is really accomplished through chak tochos, v'hacha me'avroi. Here it sits ultimately again is hammered out ultimately from the backside, and there's an actual engraving on the side upon which it's written chak yerechos, but lamaise it is worn on the raised side. So I'll say a really fascinating idea. So just point out over here, this is the end of this sugya as well. So I'll say, so halacha lamaise, this is how we paskin that you could write a get through engraving. You could write a get through engraving, but what? The get ultimately again could only be engraved through the process of what we call chak tochos, chak yerechos, but not chak tochos. Shabbos says, so for example, what that would mean is, if the husband, let's say, fashioned a stamp, a get stamp, and what do you have on the get stamp? So literally, again, it's just a get stamp. And what I would say, like when you go like into the Svarim stores in Eretz Yisrael, you can get like the, Me'esharm, you can get the Sidrim and everything personalized. So imagine a guy makes such a thing like this for a get stamp, right? It's going to be a new Judaic item, right? So just go ahead, right? Go ahead and engrave your get, right? He takes on the little things, puts on the name of the city, and just stamps it on. So I will say, so does such an engraving work? So the Gemara says it depends. If it's ultimately chak tochos, in other words, so if it's the type of stamp that ultimately depresses everything down, leaves raised writing, that will not work. An engraving, however, ultimately, again, will work. I will say it's also like, if you think about it, even from a hashkafic perspective, there's a fascinating distinction between chak tochos and chak yerechos. I will say, what's the fundamental distinction? So chak tochos, you're not directly impacting the thing that matters most. Right? The writing itself, you're not doing the writing. What are you doing? You're working on the periphery of all of the writing. Right? And you're working on the periphery, and ultimately that leaves the result. Chak yerechos is you're doing the writing itself. See, I think what Chazal is trying to impress upon us is, if you see, so many times in life, we want to accomplish something, and we do anything and everything but the actual task itself. Right? In other words, I'm like a chak tochos guy. Right? I'm talking about it, I'm discussing it, I'm planning for it, I tell everybody else what they have to do. So I'm doing everything on the periphery, right? Hoping that as long as everyone else does their thing, the result ultimately again will occur. That's called chak tochos. Working on the periphery, hoping that the raised writing, the raised result will be there. Chazal say, don't live a life of chak tochos. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. What kind of life do you need to live? Chak yerechos. You want something to get done, engrave it. Do it. Get it done. Don't worry about the periphery. Don't worry about this one doing this one doing that. If you outsource your success to other people, the things you want in life will never occur. Don't operate on the periphery of life, but rather if you want something to occur, engrave it yourself. Let's go back there. Says Rav Nachman. Rav asked Halishal from Nachman. Kasav lo get al tas shel zav. This is a very interesting case. A man says to his wife, right? He writes a get. Here's the case. He's writing a get on a gold tray, on a gold plate, right? A gold tray. And he says, V'amar hiskabli gitech v'hiskabli ksuvasech. This is fascinating. One-stop shopping over here. Right? So he writes a get on a gold plate. And he says, accept your get and also accept this as your ksuva. As your ksuva. I'll say this, by the way. We had a chasana last night. The first time I've ever saw this. And I've heard this on the Micho. So I'll say in the ksuva, the Masada Kedushin was Hasidic Rav. So I don't know if it's by the Hasidim. I'm literally reading the ksuva under the chuppah, and in there has the regular Masayim Zuz, and then it said, $100,000 Amerikai. Put in $100,000 in the ksuva itself. So I look, so the father of the chazan was like, what? Right? He was like, father of the car was like, that's right. I did like a double take. I never saw it before. But Lamais again. So again, I'm just mentioning it because here there was quite a ksuva. So anyway, the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara says over here he's writing the ksuva. He's writing the get on a gold plate. So now halacha l'maisa, he gives her the plate. He says, "This is your get, and ultimately again, this is your ksuva as well. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Amrlei niskablu gitav and niskablu ksuva sa. Ultimately again, she's received her get and she's received her ksuva. Okay, it works. In other words, we'll say it works. Now we'll say, by the way, I want to point out, it only works. It works if she accepts it. In other words, remember again, what is he doing? He's a smart guy. What is he doing? He doesn't want her to have a lien over his property anymore. Because remember again, ksuva lien devolves upon everything. So what is this guy interested in? If we're going to get divorced, let's just be done, right? Let's be done here and now. So therefore, what he does is he gives her, here's your get, here's your ksuva. So halacha l'maisa it works. Esvei hiskabli gitech v'ashar ksuva say. We'll say again a similar case. He says, accept your get v'ashar. This is the same case. Ultimately, it's written on a piece of gold, and he says the rest of the get, ultimately again, is for your ksuva. So what's the halacha? Niskabla gita v'sha'ar l'ksuva sa. Ultimately, again, she's received her ksuva. She's received her get, and the leftovers, whatever else is there, is for a ksuva. So I will say, here's what's interesting. Now, just the imagery over here is the ksuva is being the get is being written on one part of the plate, right? And there's like a border. There's a border. Ultimately, again, so the Gemara seems to say over here, the part that the get is written on, that's the get. And the border ultimately satisfies the criteria. Border satisfies the criteria for the ksuva. To which the Gemara says, "Talmud kashar." Now the reason this works is why? Because there's a border, right? Because ultimately, again, there is a remainder of this gold plate. Halek kashar lo. Sounds like over here that if there was not a border, it would not work. To which the Gemara says, no. It work even if there's no border. In other words, even if the get itself takes up the entire gold plate, it would be fine. We'll say, rather, what's the chiddush? The chiddush is even if there is a border, we'll say the only way this works is if the husband explicitly articulates that this is his machshava. Otherwise, what is he giving her? A designer get. Right? That's all it is. In other words, if he doesn't say anything, then all this is an expensive get. The only way it works is if he explicitly articulates, by the way, this is for your get and for your ksuva. So the Gemara says, my time, because without an explicit statement, ultimately, again, all it is are the margins of the get. So we'll say, Gemara introduces us to the concept that Allah Lamaisa, he could do one-stop shopping, give her a get that also satisfies the ksuva requirement. But again, he must explicitly articulate it, and of course, she must be willing to accept it. Husband says, well, listen to this. Husband says, this is your get, but the paper is mine. It's amazing that this marriage is dissolving, right? Ultimately, again, she's not divorced, because obviously, again, she has to own the get. Right? But if he says to her, this is your get, ultimately on the condition you give me back the paper, then Harezim Miguresh. It's supposed to say it works. Why does it work? Because a matana amanas lahachzir, giving someone a gift on the condition that after they acquire it, they give it back to you, it works. That does work. What happens if he says to her, you can keep the paper upon which there is writing, but the spaces on the paper between each letter, or the spaces of the paper in between the lines, I want those back. Ultimately, it says the Gemara, Teku. That we don't know what to do with. I have a sefer play. The sefer echad amrach manavalo shnayim ushlosha svarim. I have to say that it shouldn't work based on the fact that the Torah says sefer. It has to be one cohesive document, not multiple documents. To which the Gemara says, Lo tzricha dimu'ura. It's not a shayla why. So what happened over here? Talking about a case where the get was written in such a way where the writing was intertwined, right? Again, he made the kufs, the lam is long, so the writing is intertwined, and therefore ultimately again it's once here. So we'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up a Meretz with this next case of Bari Rachama. But say, don't worry, we're a little bit behind, but we'll be just fine. Incredible daf. Shkoyach.